Hello YouTube, this is the Java Programmer, and we're going to be going into episode 7 of our Forex trading system. Today, before we get into the trading part of this software, we need a class that can help us manage the configuration. We're going to have multiple configurations. We're going to have multiple files that have configuration variables. We want to be able to run our program from those configuration files and not have to recompile the code every time we make changes. So last time we tested our event system, created a bunch of classes. This time we're going to delete all those and we're going to work on our configuration helper class. So I'm going to go ahead and close down all these classes that we created. Let's go ahead and delete them. We had a event producer, event channels, so we're just going to get rid of all these classes. And of course this code's all broke. We're gonna, let's see, we're gonna keep our event router because we will be using that later on. Let's get rid of our producer. Let's just comment these out so that we have them for later. Okay, we need to create a configuration, let's see, configuration helper class. New configuration helper. And one of the things we're going to do is we want to pass this class a file that it's going to load. And so for lack of a better name, let's give it config.properties. So what it'll do is when the configuration helper, when we instantiate the class, it's going to go to this file, try to load that file, and hold onto these properties. So let's go ahead and create this file. Configuration properties. So right click, new file, config.properties. And this is in the format of variable equals value. So one of the things we want to do is we want to give this a name. Let's call it log file. It's going to be logging.log. I know we use that in our logging part, in our logger. I should say in our log4j properties, we have that here, but let's give the config.properties the ability to override that value if we want. Basically what I want this file to do is have all the properties in it that I need to start the program. And when I create a new configuration helper, I want that to do everything for me as far as configuring the program. And that would include this configuration of the logging. I want that to happen all inside the configuration helper. So what we can do here is create a new class for this configuration helper. And we want to put it in a different system, different package. We'll say .util. That doesn't exist. But it should create it and put it in there for us. That's what it did, but let's see. Eclipse sometimes doesn't put these in the correct, there we go, correct order. So our configuration helper. Now let's see, what is this complaining about? It doesn't like this. So create the constructor based on the string. This is going to be our config file. So one of the things we want to do is When this gets instantiated, we want to try to open this file up and load its properties. But we need a place to put the properties, so we need to use a properties object. Properties. Call it program config. So now we have a program config object. So when we open the file, we have to catch the exception of the file not found. So program config.load new file input stream, new file, and the file is going to be our config file. So that needs to be the full path to our config file. The next thing that we want to do is we want to initialize the logging. And we're going to initialize that based on what the file that's inside of our config file. So we can have different logging outputs. In this case, we see that we have a log file is called logging, and we want a log file properties equals, and we're going to use this file name here. So grab the name of that, which is log4j.properties. So basically what we have to do is we load in all the properties from the config file, and then we want to load in all the properties from the logging file, but not into our program config. We want to do what the app is doing over here, where we have property configurator and the name of the properties file. So we're going to pull that out of here. We're going to put that in here. And instead of our log4j properties, we're going to say program config.get property, and we're going to, the property that we want is going to be this log file property. And that is going to go in here, which should be log4j.properties. Let's see, the method configure string is not for type object. We need to cast this to a string. So now we load our config file, and then we configure our logger with the file name that's in our config file. So in this case, our log file properties file is log4j.properties. And for now, I guess we don't need log file because that's already defined in the log4j properties. So this is giving me this error because I need to catch the exception. And let's e.print stack trace. All right, so let's go back over here. For right now, we're going to comment this out and do Shift Command C. Run our program. Didn't get any errors, so it looks like it loaded this. So let's just double check on that. If we were to say log4j properties 2, we run our program, we should expect an error. There it is. No such file or directory. So that means it's actually loading our config properties file, and then it's loading our log file properties. So what else would we put in our config.properties file? One of the things that we might put in here is if we want to load extra properties. And we'll see why we want to do this a little bit later, but I want to keep the broker specific config parameters in a different file because it's going to house my private key. It's also going to house my private authentication credentials, and I don't want those to be seen by everybody. So let's just put that in here for the fun of it. Extra properties file equals extra.properties. And so what we're going to do is in our configuration helper, we're going to load this config also. So we're going to load a new file input stream, new file, and that file is going to be program config.get property, and it's going to be the property extra properties file. Now, one thing that we want to possibly do here is maybe we would like to send some of these parameters in here versus just having them hard-coded. So let's say extra properties file and string log file properties. And then what we can do here is it's going to be a string, and this is going to be a string. And if for some reason someone doesn't pass these in, we will default them. So what this default constructor is going to do, it's going to call the regular constructor with the right parameters. And typically this is done through an init method, not directly. So what we're going to have to do here is change the name of this to init. And then we'll pass in our config file, our extra properties file, and in this case a string because it was not passed in. And then we'll create one more of these. Public configuration helper, string config file, and no properties file, extra properties file. So we're going to do init, and we're going to pass all these in. This time this will be the string for this one. And what's it complaining about? Oh, I need a void here. All right. And let's default again. If there's nothing passed in, this is going to be config.properties. And let's make these, instead of be these text strings, let's make these be the actual file names. Extra.properties and log4j.properties. So these will be the file names directly. And so here we have, that's the name of the config file that's coming in. This would be the name of the extra properties file that's coming in. And this would be the name of the properties, the log properties file. So let's put that in here. So what this should do for us is it should load all these different files. I shouldn't need either one of these now in my config file. We don't even need it here because we're just going to default all these properties all at one time. So let's run our program and see what happens. We need to create this file. New file, extra.properties. Okay. There we go. Oh, there's one other method we need to put in here, and that is to get properties from the configuration once it's loaded. So we need to have a method public string get property. This would be the key that comes in, and we're going to return our program config.getProperty based on that key. So now anything that's been loaded into this properties program config should be accessible via this getProperty method. So if for instance I wanted to log here config.getProperty, and what's a property that we have we could look at? Property 1 equals, this is the value for property 1. If we run this, we should see null. Because I'm not getting, I need to give it the name, property 1. So if we get the value of property 1 and print it, there we go. We've got this value. So that sets up our property handling configurator helper. Now we'll have access to our properties all throughout the program. We do not have to reconfigure our program every time we want to change something. And this should make it a lot easier in setting up our access to the different brokers and other things. So anyway, thanks for watching. This is the Java Programmer. See you next time.